The High Sierra is a place of jagged beauty and indifferent stone. It does not care about your maps or your confidence. In July of 1981, Yosemite National Park was breathing with the heavy heat of midsummer, yet the shadows in the canyons remained cold and sharp as a razor. I have spent decades looking into the files that the authorities would rather leave in the basement gathering dust, and the case of Stacy Arras is one that stays in the back of your mind like a low-frequency hum. It is a story about how a 14-year-old girl can step behind a cluster of trees in broad daylight and simply cease to exist within the physical world. There was no struggle and no scream. There was only the sudden heavy silence of the granite. Stacy was not some inexperienced hiker who wandered off the trail because she could not read a compass. She was part of a group of 10 people, including her father, who had taken a pack trip up to the Sunrise High Sierra camp. This is an elevation of about 9,400 feet, where the air is thin and the light has a strange crystalline quality. On July 17th, the group arrived at the cabins, and the mood was light. They were miles from the nearest road and deep within the wilderness, where the only sound should have been the wind through the lodgepole pines and the occasional clatter of a mule. Stacy wanted to take some photographs of a small lake nearby, and she asked her father to come along. Her father was tired from the ride and declined, but an elderly man in their party named Gerald Stewart volunteered to walk with her. They left the camp at around 4 in the afternoon. The sun was still high, but the shadows were beginning to stretch out across the silver-grey rock. Stacy carried her camera, and her spirits were high. They walked about 700 yards from the cabins toward a small ridge that overlooked the water. Gerald was 67 years old, and the altitude was starting to pull at his breath, so he told Stacy he would sit down on a rock and wait, while she went just a little further to get her shots. He watched her walk over a small rise and disappear from his line of sight. He sat there for several minutes, listening to the stillness. The High Sierra has a way of swallowing sound. He expected to hear the click of a camera shutter or the crunch of her boots on the decomposed granite, but there was nothing. After a while, a sense of unease began to settle in his chest like cold water. He called out her name, but the wind just carried his voice away into the trees. He walked to the place where he had last seen her, expecting to find her looking at the lake or perhaps sitting on a log. Instead, he found a landscape that was utterly empty. There was no Stacy, and no sign that anyone had been there at all. The search began almost immediately. Within the first hour, the people at the camp were scouring the immediate area, but as the sun began to dip below the horizon and the temperature plummeted, they realized they were facing a nightmare. By the next morning, a full-scale search and rescue operation was underway. This was not a casual effort. They brought in helicopters and search dogs and dozens of seasoned mountain experts who knew every inch of the Yosemite backcountry. They looked behind every boulder and inside every crevasse. They expected to find a girl who had tripped and twisted an ankle, or perhaps a girl who had become disoriented and hunkered down for the night. What they found instead was a single piece of evidence that made the hair on the back of their necks stand up. Near the top of the ridge, where Stacy had last been seen, a searcher spotted a small circular object on the ground. It was the lens cap to her camera. It was sitting right there on the dirt, as if it had been placed there with intention. There were no scuff marks, and no signs of a struggle. There were no footprints leading away from it. It was as if she had been standing there preparing to take a photo, and then she was simply removed from the equation. The camera itself was gone, and Stacy was gone. The search dogs were brought to the spot where the lens cap was found. These were high-performance bloodhounds trained to track a scent through rain and over stone. They were given a piece of Stacy's clothing to catch the scent. But when they reached that spot on the ridge, the dogs did something that chilled the handlers to the bone. They did not pick up a trail and head off into the woods. Instead, they began to circle nervously. They whined and looked up into the air or back at their handlers with eyes full of confusion. The scent trail did not lead anywhere. It ended right there at the lens cap, as if Stacy had been lifted straight up into the sky. As the days turned into a week, the search grew to include over 100 people. They covered the area with a fine-tooth comb. They searched the lake with divers, thinking she might have fallen in, but the water was clear and shallow, and she was not there. They checked the cliffs and the steep drop-offs, but there was no sign of a fall. In Yosemite, the terrain is unforgiving, but it usually leaves clues. If a person is taken by a predator, there is blood or torn clothing. If a person gets lost, they leave tracks or they build a shelter. Stacy Arras left nothing but a plastic cap and a void that could not be filled. There are details about this case that the official reports tend to gloss over. Some of the searchers reported a strange feeling of being watched from the tree line. They described a heavy, oppressive atmosphere that seemed to hang over that specific ridge. Some spoke of the way the birds and the insects would suddenly go quiet, as if they were waiting for something to happen. It is a phenomenon often reported in these high-altitude disappearances. It is as if the forest itself becomes aware of an intruder. We have to ask ourselves, what could move so quickly and so silently that it could snatch a girl within earshot of an adult and leave no trace behind? Not even a broken twig. The investigators looked into every possibility, including the people in the group. They questioned Gerald Stewart repeatedly, but the old man was devastated. There was no motive and no opportunity for him to have done anything. They looked for signs of a stranger in the area, but they were miles from anywhere, and the trail was being watched. The logistics of a kidnapping in that terrain are nearly impossible. You cannot run across granite slopes, carrying a teenage girl without leaving some kind of mark. And yet the earth seemed to have opened up and swallowed her whole. Years later, researchers tried to access the full files on the Stacy Arras case through the Freedom of Information Act. They were met with a wall of silence. The National Park Service claimed that the files were part of an ongoing investigation, even though decades had passed. They refused to release the full details of the search. This level of secrecy is unusual for a missing person case in a park. It suggests that there is something in those files that they do not want the public to see. Perhaps it is a detail about the dogs, or perhaps it is a description of something found that does not fit into our understanding of the natural world. I have looked at the maps of the Sunrise High Sierra camp many times. The area where Stacy vanished is not a place where someone should just disappear forever. It is open and the visibility is good. It is the kind of place where you feel safe. But that is the trick of the wilderness. It presents a face of serenity while hiding something ancient and hungry beneath the surface. When you look at the clusters of disappearances in our national parks, you start to see a pattern. They often happen near water, and they often involve a sudden change in weather or a strange reaction from animals. Stacy Arras remains a shadow in the history of Yosemite. Her father died without ever knowing what happened to his daughter. The lens cap is likely sitting in a dusty evidence locker somewhere, a tiny plastic monument to a girl who went to take a picture and walked into another dimension. There are things in the deep woods that we are not meant to understand. There are pockets of space where the rules of physics seem to fray at the edges. When you walk into the High Sierra, you are walking into a kingdom that does not recognize your authority. The silence of the granite is not just an absence of noise. It is a presence in itself. It is a weight that presses down on you until you feel small and insignificant. On that July afternoon, Stacy Arras became part of that silence. She became another entry in a ledger of the lost that continues to grow every year. We tell ourselves stories about bears and mountain lions to keep the real fear at bay. We want to believe there is a rational explanation because the alternative is too terrifying to contemplate. We want to believe that we are at the top of the food chain. But the dogs knew. They felt something on that ridge that made them cower. They sensed a predator that does not leave tracks and does not have a scent. They knew that Stacy was not in the woods anymore. She was somewhere else. Somewhere that our eyes cannot see and our hands cannot reach. And until the authorities decide to be honest about what they find in these parks, we are all just walking blindly into the trees, hoping that the silence doesn't decide to take us next. The case of Stacy Arras bears a haunting resemblance to the disappearance of Jared Atadero in the Roosevelt National Forest in 1999. Jared was only 3 years old and was walking just ahead of a group of adults when he vanished on a well-traveled trail. Despite a massive search, no sign of him was found for 4 years until 2 hikers found his clothing and a fragment of his skull high up on a steep cliff face in an area that had been searched multiple times. Like Stacy, he vanished in the blink of an eye within calling distance of help. These cases suggest that there is a predator or a force operating in our wilderness that targets the vulnerable and moves with a speed that defies logic. The pattern is there if you're brave enough to look at it. The mountains are beautiful, but they are also a graveyard of the unexplained. The sun over the High Sierra does not warm the soul. It merely illuminates the vastness of our own insignificance against the backdrop of ancient stone. When Stacy Arras stepped away from her group in July of 1981, she was not just walking toward a lake to take a photograph. She was stepping into a blind spot of the universe. The granite peaks of Yosemite are not just geological formations. They are the ribs of something much larger and far older than the human race. We call it a national park to make it feel safe and managed. We draw lines on maps and give trails, names like Sunrise or Cathedral to pretend we have conquered the wild. But the stone remembers a time before names. It remembers the hunger that existed before the first fire was ever lit by a human hand. I have spent decades looking at the maps and the reports and the redacted files that the government insists do not exist. There is a specific kind of cold that settles in your bones when you realize that a human being can vanish in the time it takes to blink. Stacy was there one moment, a vibrant young woman with a camera and a future, and then she was gone. She did not scream. She did not struggle. She simply dissolved into the shimmering heat of the mountain afternoon. The searchers moved through the brush with their whistles and their radios, but the mountain did not echo their calls. It swallowed them. The air in the high Sierra has a way of becoming thick, almost liquid, when something like this happens. It is as if the atmosphere itself is trying to hide the crime. Think about that lens cap found on the ground. It was not crushed into the dirt. It was not lost in a scramble for life. It was sitting there, a small circle of black plastic resting on the forest floor like a period at the end of a sentence. It was a marker for a life that had been cut short by something that does not leave footprints. When the investigators found it, they did not find Stacy. They did not find a single drop of blood or a scrap of her clothing. The mountain took the girl and left the plastic. It is a cruel trade. It tells us that whatever is operating in those woods has no use for our technology. It only wants the warmth of the living. It wants the spark that makes us human. The dogs are the most honest witnesses we have in these cases. A bloodhound does not care about park statistics or political optics. A bloodhound only knows the truth of the scent. And on that ridge in Yosemite, the dogs did something that should haunt every hiker who sets foot on a trail. They did not lose the trail. They did not get confused by the wind. They stopped. They tucked their tails between their legs and they whimpered. They looked into the empty air and they saw something that the human eye is not calibrated to perceive. They felt a predator that vibrates at a frequency we have forgotten how to hear. When a dog refuses to track, it is because the trail does not lead to a person anymore. It leads to an opening. We talk about the weather in these disappearances as if it is a coincidence. We say the fog rolled in or the storm broke just as the search began. But if you look at enough of these files, you see that the weather is a tool. It is a curtain drawn across a stage. In 1981, the sky over Yosemite was clear until it was not. The clouds did not drift in from the horizon. They seemed to manifest out of the granite itself. They were heavy and gray and smelled of ozone and wet iron. It was a wall of mist that neutralized the helicopters and blinded the search parties. It was a tactical deployment of the elements. It was as if the mountain was closing its eyes so that no one could see what it was doing with Stacy. There is a theory among those of us who have stared too long into the abyss that the granite itself is a conductor. It is rich in quartz and minerals that can hold an electrical charge. When the conditions are right, when the pressure of the atmosphere meets the vibration of the earth, the rules of physics begin to soften. The world becomes permeable. You might think you are walking on a solid trail, but you are actually walking on a thin crust of reality over an ocean of something else. Stacy Arras might have stepped onto a patch of ground that was no longer ground. She might have slipped through a fold in the fabric of the three-dimensional world. To her, she was just taking a step toward a better angle for a photo. To us, she was falling into forever. I have sat in quiet rooms with the fathers and mothers of the disappeared. I have seen the way the light has gone out of their eyes. Stacy's father died with a hole in his heart that no amount of time could bridge. He spent his final years wondering if his daughter was cold, if she was afraid, or if she was still out there in some capacity we cannot understand. The authorities tell these families that it was a mountain lion or a fall. They offer these platitudes because the truth is too heavy to carry. The truth is that the National Park Service knows there are places where people go and never come back. They know there are clusters of disappearances that defy every law of probability. But to admit that would be to admit that they are not in control of the land they claim to protect. The silence of the woods is not a lack of sound. It is a physical weight. If you have ever been truly alone in the high country, you have felt it. It is a humming in your ears that sounds like 1,000 voices whispering just below the threshold of hearing. It is the sound of the mountain breathing. On the day Stacy vanished, that silence was absolute. The birds stopped singing. The insects went still. It was a vacuum of noise that precedes a strike. In that silence, the predator moves. It does not need to be fast when it can simply be everywhere at once. It does not need to be strong when it can simply erase you from the timeline. The lens cap remains the only evidence. A tiny plastic monument in a box in a basement. It represents the last moment Stacy Arras was part of our world. She reached for her camera, she removed the cap, and in that second the mountain decided she belonged to the stone. There is something deeply unsettling about the lack of struggle. It suggests a process that is as natural and as indifferent as a spider taking a fly. We want there to be a villain. We want there to be a monster with teeth and claws because we know how to fight monsters. We do not know how to fight a landscape that has developed a taste for us. I often wonder about the things we find in the woods months or years later. The shoes with the feet still inside them. The clothing turned inside out and stacked neatly on a log. These are not the actions of a wild animal. A bear does not undress its prey. These are the actions of something that is curious about us. Something that is trying to understand the strange, soft creatures that wander into its kingdom with their nylon backpacks and their plastic cameras. It is a cold, clinical curiosity. It is the way a child might pull the wings off a moth to see how it works. Stacy was the moth, and Yosemite was the child. Every year, millions of people flock to these parks. They stand in line for photographs, and they eat ice cream in the shadows of the cliffs. They feel safe because there are signs and rangers in flat hats. But the rangers know. You can see it in the way they look at the tree line when the sun starts to dip below the horizon. They know that the boundary between the civilized and the ancient is as thin as a sheet of paper. They know that every time a person walks off the trail, they are gambling with a power that does not recognize their humanity. They are walking into a ledger that has been being written since the glaciers retreated. The case of Stacy Arras is a warning that we refuse to heed. We continue to walk into the trees. We continue to believe that we are the masters of the earth. But the granite does not care about our beliefs. It does not care about our technology or our laws. It is a hungry ancient thing that sits and waits. It waited for Stacy. It waited for the moment she was alone, just for a few seconds, and then it reached out. The searchers can look forever, but they are looking in the wrong dimension. They are looking for a body, when they should be looking for a shadow. When you look at the map of these disappearances, the points of last seen often cluster around water and high-elevation granite. There is a geometry to it. It is as if these locations are nodes on a circuit. The water provides the energy, the granite provides the conductor, and the human being provides the ground. It is a machine that we are walking through without knowing it. Stacy was just a component in a process that was set in motion long before she was born. She was at the wrong coordinates at the wrong time and the machine turned on. The official reports will tell you that the search was exhaustive. They will tell you how many man-hours were spent and how many square miles were covered. They will use large numbers to hide the fact that they found nothing. They will talk about the terrain and the difficulty of the brush. But they will not talk about the dogs cowering. They will not talk about the lens cap. They will not talk about the fact that Stacy Arras disappeared in a space no larger than a living room while people were standing just a few yards away. To talk about those things would be to admit that there is a predator in our midst that we cannot stop. I have walked those trails myself. I have felt that prickle on the back of my neck that tells me I am being watched by something that does not have eyes. I have felt the air grow cold and still in the middle of a summer afternoon. In those moments, I do not think about the beauty of the mountains. I think about Stacy. I think about the way she must have felt in that final second when she realized the world was no longer what she thought it was. I think about the lens cap and the silence. And I turn around and I walk back toward the lights of the city as fast as my legs will carry me. We are a species that likes to have answers. We build laboratories and we write books to explain the world. But the high country of Yosemite is a place where answers go to die. It is a place of questions that have no bottom. Why, Stacy? Why then? Why there? The mountain does not answer. It only stares back with its gray, unblinking eyes. It is a kingdom of stone and silence, and we are only temporary visitors. We are guests who have overstayed our welcome, and every so often, the host decides to take a souvenir. There are those who say that the government is hiding the bodies. They say there are tunnels beneath the parks, and that the missing are being taken for experiments. I think the truth is much simpler and much more terrifying. I think the government is just as afraid as we are. I think they keep the files redacted because they don't want us to know that they are powerless. They don't want us to know that our national treasures are actually hunting grounds. They want us to keep paying our entrance fees and keep believing the lie that the woods are a place of healing. If you go into the woods, do not go alone. Do not step off the trail to take a photograph. Do not trust the silence. If the birds stop singing, if the air feels heavy, if you smell ozone on a clear day, run. Do not look back. Do not stop to pick up your lens cap. Just run. Because once the mountain decides it wants you, there is no force on this earth that can pull you back. You will become a name in a folder, a story told in whispers, and a shadow in the history of the high country. The legacy of Stacy Arras is not just a missing person case. It is a crack in the foundation of our reality. It is a reminder that we are not as safe as we think we are. We are living on the edge of a great dark forest, and there are things in that forest that have been watching us for a very long time. They are patient. They are efficient. And they are very, very hungry. We can tell ourselves whatever stories we need to sleep at night, but the truth remains sitting on the forest floor, a small black circle of plastic waiting for someone to understand what it really means. The case of Stacy Arras is far from the only one of its kind. In June of 1969, a 6-year-old boy named Dennis Martin was playing hide-and-seek with his brothers in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. He ducked behind a bush for a split second and he was gone. Despite one of the largest searches in the history of the Park Service, involving the Green Berets and thousands of volunteers, not a single trace of Dennis was ever found. Witness reports of a hairy creature carrying something over its shoulder in the area were dismissed by the authorities, much like the strange details in Stacy's case. These disappearances are not accidents. They are harvests. They are the price we pay for wandering into a kingdom that does not recognize our authority. The mountains are beautiful, but they are also a graveyard of the unexplained, and they are always looking for new residents.